Okay, so the next thing that we want to talk about, the last definition, if you will, is a level of significance. It is always denoted by alpha. That's a level of significance, okay? So your level of significance, alpha, is the probability of making a type 1 error. Of making a type 1 error. So your level of significance says, what's the likelihood that I'm going to make a type 1 error? And you remember what the type 1 error was? It means we reject the null hypothesis. Let me swing it back. We are rejecting the null hypothesis when I shouldn't. All right? So you're changing your mind when you shouldn't. Original is valid. Okay? So what's the probability that I'm going to make that type of an error? That's a level of significance. Okay? The probability is chosen by the researcher before the sample data is collected. All right? So that's part of what's laid out in advance of what we can look at. Okay? And that's always given to you because it's laid out before. So you're always going to be given this level of significance and then you work with that. All right, so the Medco pharmaceutical company has developed a new antibiotic. We've read this 10 billion times already. From example 2A, we know the null hypothesis is P is equal to 0.02. The alternative is P is greater than 0.02. So we already have this down pat. We know this to be the null and this to be the alternative hypothesis. Now here's the question. Suppose that the sample evidence indicates the following two scenarios. Here's our first scenario. Suppose that the null hypothesis is rejected. State the conclusion. So we're not saying there's an error here. We're just practicing stating a conclusion because that's important. We state the hypothesis, right? There are 3 levels to this. We state what the hypothesis is. We do our work on it and then we analyze it. And analyzing is stating that conclusion, saying, based on my evidence, this is what we're coming up with. All right. So this is, let me get rid of all these little dots here. Because the null hypothesis is rejected. So we're not making any errors. We're saying this is legit. So we've done our work. The null is rejected. Oops, HYP. I skipped a couple letters there, didn't I? Hypothesis is rejected. This is how our sentence is stated. I'm going to put ... actually. This is how we're going to state these from here on out. There is sufficient evidence to conclude that the proportion of children who experience a headache as a side effect is more than 0.02. Okay, now look at what's happening here. There is sufficient evidence to conclude that the proportion, and that's why, because we say proportion, we make this a decimal, of children who experience a headache as a side effect is more than 2%. My null hypothesis is rejected. Here's how I like to say this. If this null hypothesis is rejected, then we are going to change our minds. You have proven to me there is sufficient evidence. I have done the work. I have collected data. I have got the information. There is sufficient evidence to change our minds. If we're going to change our minds, we reject what we started with. You see how that is? We reject what we start with. We change our minds because the evidence is enough to change our minds. Okay, see now where they're starting to see where this reject and do not reject come in? Okay, by that same rationale, I'm going to scoot this up. The null hypothesis is not rejected. State the conclusion. All right. So I'm just going to write because the null hypothesis is not rejected, ... Then we state there is not sufficient evidence to say the proportion of children. You have to state what it is that you're doing. The proportion of children who experience Wow. I totally messed up that. See, I get to going too fast and my brain doesn't catch up. The proportion of children who experience a headache as a side effect is more than 0.02. Now I want to point something out to you. First of all, is not sufficient evidence. You do not reject, so there's not sufficient evidence. Do you see that? They both have the word not in it. There's not enough evidence, so I do not reject. That means you keep the status quo. Keep the status quo. There is not enough evidence. You cannot change my mind. All right? You have not proven anything. My current data holds true. My current statistic holds true because you did not produce enough evidence to change our minds. That's what's happening there. Okay? And notice it's the exact same thing. So if I'm looking at these words, there is sufficient evidence to conclude that the proportion of children who experience a headache as a side effect is more than 2%. There, sufficient evidence to say the proportion of children who experience a headache as a side effect is more than 2%. Literally everything is exactly the same in these statements. You just determine if it is sufficient evidence or is not sufficient evidence. Everything else is literally the same. Now, when you're looking at this, these words come right from your problem. Who experience a headache as a side effect is more than 2%. Who experience a headache as a side effect is more than 2%. Who experience a headache as a side effect is more than 2%. Who experience a headache as a side effect is more than 2%. It's all from the problem. You're not creating anything new here. You're just reiterating the problem. The biggest question is there sufficient evidence? Is there not sufficient evidence? And that's what this conclusion down here is stating. The conclusion is or is not, all of the rest of these words, and then insert the statement is what you do. That's how you make a conclusion. That's how you set this up. So at the bottom of every single problem that we are going to do as we move forward with this, we're going to get a null, we're going to get an alternative hypothesis, and then we're going to do our work. And at the very end, you will always make this statement. All right? Get the information from your problem and determine if there is or is not sufficient evidence. And then that is how you know whether to reject or not reject. And that's how it is. As we move forward with chapter 10, I think it's going to make more sense because we're actually going to put this into play. But I think it's important to get the understanding of what these words mean and what we're going with. Then we can put them into play. And that's what you're doing here. So good job.